The museum guide smiled at him dismissively. Sorry, the warship is for military personnel only. The old man stood quietly, leaning on his walking stick. Young visitors also looked at him and giggled. He probably was never even a sailor. But when the ship's lieutenant commander saw that old man, he froze. The morning fog still clung to San Francisco Bay as crowds gathered outside the Intruder Bay Naval Museum for the annual Veterans Day celebration. Families with children, military enthusiasts, and tourists formed long lines waiting to board the USS Valiant, a decommissioned destroyer that had served with distinction during the Vietnam War. The ship, now permanently moored as a floating museum, represented one of the most significant pieces of naval history on the West Coast. Its gray hull gleamed under the autumn sun, flags snapping in the bay breeze as visitors prepared for guided tours that would take them through decades of American naval heritage. Among the crowd, a solitary figure moved slowly toward the entrance. The elderly man appeared to be in his late 70s, his weathered face marked by deep lines that spoke of a lifetime spent under harsh conditions. He wore a simple brown jacket over a white-collared shirt, dark slacks, and carried a wooden walking stick that he leaned on heavily with each deliberate step. His appearance was unremarkable by most standards, just another aging veteran come to pay respects on a day dedicated to military service. But there was something in his bearing, a subtle straightness to his posture despite his obvious physical limitations, that suggested a military background to those trained to notice such things. The museum entrance buzzed with activity as volunteers checked tickets and directed visitors toward different tour groups. Bright banners announced special exhibits about submarine warfare, naval aviation, and the destroyer's role in Southeast Asian operations during the 1970s. Gift shop volunteers sold miniature ship models and military memorabilia while active duty sailors in dress uniforms stood ready to answer questions about modern naval operations. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory, designed to honor military service while educating the public about naval history. As the old man approached the ticket booth, the volunteer, a college-aged student working the Veterans Day event, looked up with a practiced smile. "Good morning. Are you here for the general admission tour?" "I was hoping to see the ship," the old man replied quietly, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested years of shouting over engine noise and ocean wind. "Particularly the bridge and operations areas." The volunteer's expression shifted slightly as she consulted her computer screen. "I'm sorry, sir, but those sections are part of our premium military tour. It's designed for veterans and active duty personnel only. Do you have military identification?" The old man reached slowly into his jacket pocket, movements deliberate and careful. His gnarled fingers, marked by old scars and the telltale stiffness of arthritis, searched through what appeared to be a worn leather wallet. After a moment, he withdrew his hand empty. "I seem to have left my identification at home," he said simply. "Perhaps I could speak with someone about accessing those areas anyway." The volunteer's smile became more strained, though she tried to maintain professionalism. "I understand, sir, but we have strict security protocols. The general admission tour covers most of the ship's public areas, including the mess hall, crew quarters, and main deck. It's really quite comprehensive." A family with 2 young children had lined up behind the old man, and the father was beginning to show signs of impatience as the conversation continued. Other visitors glanced over, some checking their phones or watches as the line slowed. "Look," the volunteer continued, lowering her voice slightly, "I'd love to help, but without proper military credentials, I can't authorize access to the restricted sections. It's an insurance liability issue as much as anything else." The old man nodded slowly, showing no signs of frustration or disappointment. "I understand completely. Security protocols exist for good reasons." But as he spoke, a group of teenagers who had overheard the exchange began whispering among themselves. One of them, a lanky boy with an expensive smartphone, snickered audibly. "Probably wasn't even in the military," he muttered to his friends, not quite quietly enough to avoid being overheard. "Old guys always try to get free stuff by pretending they were soldiers or whatever." His companion, a girl with multiple piercings and an attitude that suggested she found most adults tiresome, rolled her eyes dramatically. Like, why would anyone even want to crawl around some old rusty ship anyway? It's not like it has Wi-Fi. The old man's eyes flickered briefly toward the teenagers, but his expression remained neutral. He had clearly heard their comments, but chose not to respond. Instead, he simply stepped aside to allow the family behind him to approach the ticket booth. "General admission, please," he told the volunteer, reaching for his wallet again to pay the entrance fee. As he completed his transaction, more comments drifted from the teenage group. "Bet he was probably just a cook or something," one said. "Maybe cleaned the bathrooms. Or drove the garbage truck," another added, causing the group to burst into barely suppressed laughter. An older woman standing nearby, clearly the mother of one of the teenagers, shot them a disapproving look and hissed, "Show some respect." But the damage was done. The old man had heard every word, and while his face showed no reaction, something in his posture suggested he was accustomed to such dismissiveness. The USS Valiant had been commissioned in 1969, just as American involvement in Vietnam was reaching its peak. For 6 years, the destroyer had patrolled the waters off Southeast Asia, providing fire support for ground operations, escorting supply convoys, and conducting search and rescue missions in some of the most dangerous waters of the conflict. Now, 50 years later, the ship served as a monument to that turbulent period in American history. Preserved in remarkable detail, it offered visitors a chance to experience naval life as it had been during one of the nation's most controversial wars. The tour began on the main deck, where a retired Navy petty officer named Rodriguez served as the primary guide. Rodriguez, a veteran of the Gulf War who had served on similar vessels, possessed the kind of technical knowledge and storytelling ability that brought the ship's history to life for civilian visitors. "Welcome aboard the USS Valiant," he announced to the gathered crowd of about 30 people. This destroyer saw action throughout the Vietnam conflict, participating in major operations from the Mekong Delta to the DMZ. "Today, you'll get a chance to see how 300 sailors lived and worked in one of the most challenging environments the Navy has ever faced." The old man positioned himself toward the back of the group, moving slowly but keeping pace as Rodriguez led them through the ship's various compartments. He listened intently to the guide's descriptions, occasionally nodding at technical details or tactical explanations that seemed to resonate with personal knowledge. As they moved through the crew quarters, Rodriguez explained the cramped living conditions that sailors had endured during extended deployments. "These bunks were home for months at a time," he said, gesturing toward the tight rows of sleeping berths. Privacy was non-existent, personal space was at a premium, and the constant noise and vibration of the ship's engines made rest difficult even during off-duty hours. A middle-aged man in the group raised his hand. "What about combat situations? How did the crew handle being under fire?" Rodriguez's expression grew more serious. "The Valiant participated in numerous shore bombardment missions, providing fire support for ground troops. But the ship also came under attack multiple times from shore batteries and small boat raids. The crew had to be ready for anything, and they were." The old man's eyes seemed to sharpen at this description, and he unconsciously straightened his posture. His grip on his walking stick tightened slightly, and for a moment, the careful mask of elderly frailty slipped to reveal something harder underneath. As the tour continued into the ship's communications center, Rodriguez pointed out the various radio equipment and navigation systems that had been cutting-edge technology during the Vietnam era. From this room, the ship's operations were coordinated with other naval units, aircraft, and ground forces throughout Southeast Asia. The communications officer and his team worked around the clock to maintain contact with headquarters, Rodriguez continued. They processed intelligence reports, coordinated logistics, and most importantly, provided communication support for special operations forces who depended on the ship for extraction and fire support. At the mention of special operations, the old man's attention became laser-focused. He moved closer to examine the radio equipment, his eyes scanning the control panels with the kind of familiarity that suggested personal experience rather than casual interest. A woman in the tour group noticed his intense concentration. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the old man directly. "You seem to know something about this equipment. Were you in the Navy?" The question caused several other tour participants to turn and look at him expectantly. The teenagers who had mocked him earlier also turned, smirks on their faces as if anticipating another opportunity for amusement. The old man hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I spent some time on ships like this," he said quietly. "Different era, same ocean." Rodriguez, who had overheard the exchange, stepped closer with professional interest. "What was your rating, sir? Your specialty?" "I worked with small boat operations," the old man replied carefully. "Coastal patrols, that sort of thing." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Rodriguez nodded respectfully and moved on with the tour, but something in the old man's bearing had caught his attention. The way he stood, the way he examined the equipment, the careful precision of his movements despite his age, it all suggested a level of military experience that went beyond ordinary service. As they moved toward the ship's armament displays, Rodriguez began explaining the destroyer's primary weapon systems. The Valiant carried a main battery of 5-inch guns, capable of delivering precise fire support up to 20 miles inland. These weapons were crucial for supporting ground operations and protecting other vessels in the fleet. The old man studied the gun mounts with obvious familiarity, unconsciously mouthing technical specifications before Rodriguez stated them aloud. A retired Marine in the group noticed this and exchanged glances with his wife, who shrugged as if to say, "Some of these old-timers know their stuff." But it was when they reached the ship's small boat stations that the old man's demeanor changed completely. Rodriguez gestured toward the davits and winches used to launch and recover smaller craft. The Valiant carried several small boats for various missions, personnel transfer, supply runs, and search and rescue operations. But during the Vietnam War, these boats were also used for some of the most dangerous missions the Navy undertook. He paused for dramatic effect. Special Operations Forces, Navy SEALs and other units, depended on ships like the Valiant for insertion and extraction from hostile territory. The sailors who operated these boats were volunteers for some of the most hazardous duty in the entire conflict. The old man moved closer to the boat stations, running his weathered fingers along the metal surfaces with a gentleness that suggested intimate familiarity. His eyes took on a distant quality, as if he were seeing not the museum display before him, but memories of nights when these same systems had meant the difference between life and death. The tour was moving toward its conclusion when an unexpected interruption occurred. A young officer in Navy dress uniform appeared on deck, moving with the purposeful stride of someone on official business. He spoke briefly with Rodriguez, who then approached the old man. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "Lieutenant Commander Hayes would like a word with you, if you don't mind." The old man looked puzzled but nodded his agreement. The teenage group immediately began speculating among themselves about what kind of trouble the old man might be in, while other tour participants watched with curiosity as the officer approached. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was a man in his mid-30s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command responsibility. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, but there was something in his expression that suggested nervousness or uncertainty. "Sir," he began formally, "I'm Lieutenant Commander Hayes, currently serving as the ship's museum liaison officer. I've been observing your tour, and I was wondering if I might ask you a few questions." The old man leaned more heavily on his walking stick. "I'm not sure what I could tell you that would be of interest, Commander." Hayes glanced around at the gathered tour group, clearly aware that their conversation was being observed by multiple witnesses. "Sir, would you mind if I asked your name?" "Morrison," the old man replied simply. "James Morrison." The effect of this simple statement on Lieutenant Commander Hayes was immediate and profound. His face went pale, and he actually took a step backward as if he had received a physical blow. "Sir," he said, his voice now carrying a different tone entirely, one of profound respect mixed with disbelief. "Would that be Master Chief James Morrison?" The old man's eyebrows rose slightly. "I retired as a Master Chief, yes. Though that was a long time ago." Hayes turned toward the tour group, his expression now one of someone who had just realized they were in the presence of living history. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the deck, "I need to inform you that you've been touring this ship in the company of one of the most decorated Navy SEALs in the history of the Vietnam War." A collective gasp rose from the tour group. The teenagers who had been mocking Morrison earlier suddenly looked embarrassed and uncertain, while the veterans in the group immediately straightened to attention. "Master Chief Morrison," Hayes continued, "served with SEAL Team 1 from 1970 to 1975. He conducted over 40 classified missions behind enemy lines, including several operations launched directly from this very ship." Morrison held up a hand, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "Commander, that's not necessary." "Sir, with respect," Hayes interrupted gently, "it absolutely is necessary. Some stories need to be told." Hayes gestured toward the ship's bridge structure. Master Chief Morrison wasn't just any SEAL. He was the senior enlisted advisor for riverine operations in the Mekong Delta, and he personally developed many of the small boat tactics that are still used by special operations forces today. Morrison's discomfort was obvious, but Hayes continued with the enthusiasm of someone sharing genuinely important history. "Sir, I studied your operations reports at the Naval War College. The Tay Ninh extraction alone saved the lives of 37 American prisoners of war." At this revelation, the atmosphere on deck changed completely. Parents pulled their children closer, wanting them to witness this unexpected moment of living history. The veterans in the group moved forward, their faces showing recognition of the significance of what they were hearing. One of them, an older man wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, spoke up. "Master Chief, I was Army, 25th Infantry Division. We heard stories about SEAL operations in our area, but we never knew details." Morrison nodded acknowledgement. "Different wars happening in the same place," he said quietly. "Your people had the hard job, holding ground day after day. We just went in and out." "Just went in and out," Hayes repeated with obvious amazement. "Sir, you conducted more successful extractions of downed pilots than any other SEAL in the theater. The Air Force still studies your methods." The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the ship that something significant was happening on deck. Museum staff appeared, along with other tour groups who had heard the commotion. Rodriguez, the tour guide, stepped forward with obvious excitement. "Master Chief, I've been giving tours on this ship for 5 years, and I had no idea. I've told the story of the Valiant Special Operations Support dozens of times, but I never imagined I'd meet someone who actually lived it." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't the only one, you know. There were a lot of good sailors who made those missions possible." "Yes, sir," Hayes agreed. "But you were the one who led them. And you were the one who insisted that no man be left behind, regardless of the risk." A woman in the crowd raised her hand tentatively. "Could you tell us about one of those missions? If it's not still classified, I mean." Morrison looked around at the expectant faces surrounding him. These weren't the dismissive teenagers or bureaucratic volunteers from earlier. These were people genuinely interested in understanding a piece of history they had never expected to encounter firsthand. "I suppose some of it can be shared now," he said slowly. "It was all declassified years ago." Morrison moved closer to the ship's rail, his eyes focusing on the water of San Francisco Bay as if seeing instead the muddy waters of the Mekong Delta decades earlier. "The Tay Ninh operation," he began, "was supposed to be a routine prisoner snatch. Intelligence had located a North Vietnamese camp holding American POWs about 30 kilometers upriver from our base. The plan was simple: go in fast, get our people, get out." He paused, collecting his thoughts. Simple plans have a way of becoming complicated when you're actually executing them. The crowd had grown silent, hanging on every word as Morrison continued. "We launched from the Valiant at 0200 hours on March 15, 1973. 2 patrol boats, 12 SEALs, supporting fire from the ship if needed. Weather was terrible, monsoon season, low visibility, river running high and fast." Morrison's voice took on the cadence of someone accustomed to operational briefings, precise and detailed despite the passage of decades. The intelligence was wrong about the camp's location. Instead of finding a temporary holding facility, we discovered a permanent prison compound with over 200 enemy troops and serious defensive positions. A veteran in the crowd winced. "What did you do?" "What we always did," Morrison replied matter-of-factly. "Adapted to the situation. We couldn't abort, we'd confirmed American prisoners were inside, and leaving them wasn't an option." Hayes had been listening with rapt attention. "Sir, the after-action report said you modified the extraction plan in real time under direct enemy fire." Morrison nodded. "We split the team. Half created a diversion on the camp's south side while the other half breached the prisoner compound from the north. The idea was to draw attention away from the POWs while we got them out." "How long did the operation take?" someone asked. 47 minutes from insertion to extraction," Morrison replied with the precision of someone who had lived those minutes under extreme stress. "But it felt like 47 hours. Morrison's hands, which had been resting on his walking stick, now gestured as he described the tactical situation. Despite his age and physical limitations, there was no mistaking the sharp military mind that had planned and executed operations under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. "The diversion worked better than expected," he continued. "Enemy forces concentrated on our south team, which gave us the opening we needed. We breached the compound, located 37 American prisoners, and began moving them toward the extraction point." "What about resistance?" Rodriguez asked. Morrison's expression grew grim. "Heavy. The enemy realized what was happening and shifted forces to intercept us. We had to fight our way to the river while protecting prisoners who hadn't eaten a decent meal or seen proper medical care in months." The teenagers who had mocked Morrison earlier were now listening with wide eyes, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine awe. One of them raised her hand tentatively. "Were you scared?" she asked, then immediately looked embarrassed by the question. Morrison studied her for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Terrified," he admitted. "Fear keeps you alive in situations like that. The trick is not letting it paralyze you." Hayes stepped forward again. "Master Chief, could you tell them about the river extraction? How you got 37 prisoners and 12 SEALs out of a hot zone?" Morrison hesitated, and for the first time since the recognition had begun, he looked truly uncomfortable. That part's harder to talk about." "Sir." Hayes prompted gently. Morrison sighed deeply. "We reached the extraction point, but enemy forces had moved faster than we anticipated. They had positions on both sides of the river, and our patrol boats were taking heavy fire. The prisoners were in no condition for an extended firefight." His voice became quieter, forcing the crowd to lean in to hear. "I made the decision to call in naval gunfire support from the Valiant. 5-inch guns, danger close to our position." The veterans in the crowd understood immediately what this meant. Danger close meant calling in artillery or naval gunfire so near to friendly forces that there was significant risk of casualties from your own weapons. "How close?" the Marine veteran asked. 50 meters, Morrison replied simply. The crowd fell silent. Even those without military experience understood that calling in naval gunfire 50 meters from your own position was either an act of desperation or extraordinary confidence in your fire support team. The Valiant's gunnery officer, Morrison continued, was a young lieutenant named David Chen. Fresh out of Naval Academy, first combat deployment. I had to convince him to fire shells that would land close enough to our position that we could feel the concussion. Hayes nodded. Lieutenant Chen later became Admiral Chen, Pacific Fleet Commander. He credited that mission with teaching him the importance of trusting your people on the ground. Morrison's eyes grew distant again. Those shells landed exactly where they needed to. Suppressed enemy fire long enough for us to get the prisoners loaded and start downriver. But the boats were damaged, overloaded, and we had wounded personnel. Did everyone make it out? A woman asked. Morrison's pause answered the question before his words did. We lost 2 men, he said quietly. Petty Officer Williams and Seaman Rodriguez, no relation, he added with a nod toward the tour guide. They stayed behind to provide covering fire while we evacuated the prisoners. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the crowd processed this information. Here was a man who had saved 37 lives but carried the weight of 2 deaths for over 40 years. They volunteered, Morrison added, his voice barely audible. I didn't order them to stay. They volunteered. Hayes placed a respectful hand on Morrison's shoulder. Sir, their families received full honors, and their names are on the Vietnam Memorial. But those 37 prisoners went home to their families because of decisions you made under impossible circumstances. As Morrison's story continued, more people had gathered on deck. Word had spread throughout the museum that a Vietnam War hero was sharing first-hand accounts of combat operations, and soon nearly 100 visitors had assembled to listen. Among the new arrivals was a family consisting of parents and 2 young children. The father, a man in his 40s wearing a Navy base cap, had pushed to the front of the crowd with obvious urgency. Excuse me, he said, addressing Morrison directly. Master Chief Morrison. Morrison turned toward the voice. Yes. Sir, my name is Captain Rodriguez, I'm stationed at NAS Lemoore. My grandfather was Seaman First Class Miguel Rodriguez, who served with SEAL Team 1 during Vietnam. Morrison's entire demeanor changed instantly. His back straightened, his eyes sharpened, and despite his age, he suddenly looked every inch the senior enlisted leader he had once been. Miguel Rodriguez, he repeated slowly. He was one of the 2 men who stayed behind during the Tay Ninh extraction. Captain Rodriguez nodded, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, sir. He was my grandfather. My family has always wondered about the details of how he died. The official reports were classified for decades. The crowd fell completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something profoundly personal and significant. Morrison studied the younger man's face carefully. You have his eyes, he said finally. And his jawline. Miguel was one of the finest sailors I ever served with. Could you tell me what happened? Captain Rodriguez asked. My grandmother died never knowing the details of his final mission. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with memories he had probably tried to forget. Your grandfather, he began slowly, saved the lives of 37 American prisoners of war and 12 Navy SEALs. He did it knowingly, willingly, and without a moment's hesitation. He paused, gathering himself. When we reached the extraction point, enemy forces had us pinned down. The patrol boats were taking heavy fire, and the prisoners were in no condition for an extended firefight. Your grandfather and Petty Officer Williams volunteered to establish a rear guard position while we evacuated the POWs. Morrison's voice grew stronger as he continued. I tried to order them to fall back with the rest of us, but Miguel looked me in the eye and said, Master Chief, those prisoners have families waiting for them. Someone has to make sure they get home. Captain Rodriguez wiped his eyes, clearly struggling with the emotion of hearing these details for the first time. They held that position for 23 minutes, Morrison continued. Long enough for us to get all 37 prisoners loaded and start downriver. When enemy forces finally overran their position, your grandfather and Williams had given us the time we needed to complete the mission. Morrison reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small object, a military challenge coin worn smooth by decades of handling. This belonged to your grandfather, he said, extending it toward Captain Rodriguez. I've carried it for 48 years, hoping someday I'd find someone in his family to return it to. Captain Rodriguez took the coin with reverent hands, examining the SEAL Team 1 insignia engraved on its surface. Sir, I don't know what to say. Miguel Rodriguez died a hero, Morrison said simply. He knew the cost of his decision, and he made it anyway because it was the right thing to do. Every one of those 37 prisoners went home to their families because of his sacrifice. As the emotional exchange between Morrison and Captain Rodriguez concluded, movement in the crowd caught everyone's attention. The teenager who had earlier made the cruel comment about Morrison probably being just a cook was pushing forward through the assembled visitors. She stopped directly in front of Morrison, her face flushed with embarrassment and shame. "Sir," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to apologize for what I said earlier. I had no idea who you were or what you had done." Morrison studied her for a moment, then nodded gently. "How could you have known? I'm just an old man with a walking stick to you." "But that's the point," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "I shouldn't have judged you based on how you looked. My teacher always talks about respecting veterans, but I didn't even think about the fact that you might be one." Morrison's expression softened. "What's your name, young lady?" "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Chen." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Chen? Any relation to Admiral David Chen?" Sarah looked confused. "That's my grandfather." "How did you, oh?" Understanding dawned on her face. "You knew him during the war?" "Lieutenant David Chen was the gunnery officer aboard this ship during the Tay Ninh operation," Morrison explained. "He's the one who fired the naval gunfire support that allowed us to complete the mission. I trusted him with the lives of my entire team, and he didn't let us down." Sarah stared at Morrison in amazement. "My grandfather never told us details about his Navy service. He just said he did his job and came home." "That sounds like David," Morrison replied with a slight smile. "He was always modest about his contributions. But I want you to know that your grandfather's precision and courage under pressure saved the lives of 49 Americans that night." Hayes stepped forward. "Sarah, your grandfather's fire support during the Tay Ninh operation is still studied at the Naval War College as an example of perfect coordination between surface vessels and special operations forces." Sarah looked back and forth between Morrison and Hayes, clearly overwhelmed by this unexpected connection between her family history and the living legend standing in front of her. "Sir," she said to Morrison, "would it be okay if I called my grandfather and told him you're here? He lives nearby, and I think he'd want to see you." Morrison considered this for a moment. "It's been a long time since David and I spoke. I'd be honored to see him again." As Sarah stepped aside to make her phone call, other members of the crowd began approaching Morrison with their own connections to his story. A middle-aged woman introduced herself as the daughter of one of the POWs rescued during the Tay Ninh operation. A man in his 60s revealed that he had served as a hospital corpsman who treated prisoners after their extraction. Each connection seemed to add another layer to the significance of Morrison's unexpected presence at the museum. What had begun as a routine Veterans Day tour was transforming into an impromptu reunion of people whose lives had been touched by operations most had never been able to discuss publicly. Rodriguez, the tour guide, approached Morrison with obvious excitement. "Master Chief, I hope you don't mind, but I've contacted the museum director. She's on her way down here, and she's bringing some people from the local Navy League chapter." Morrison sighed slightly. "I really just came to see the ship, you know. All this attention wasn't what I had in mind." "Sir," Hayes interjected, "with respect, stories like yours are exactly why we preserve ships like the Valiant. Most visitors leave here with some appreciation for naval history, but they've never met someone who actually lived it." Lieutenant Commander Hayes gestured toward the growing crowd. "Look around, sir. You've got 3 generations of Americans here, learning firsthand about sacrifice and service from someone who embodied both. This is history coming alive." As if to prove Hayes's point, a local news crew that had been covering the Veterans Day events arrived on deck, having heard reports of something significant happening aboard the museum ship. The reporter, a young woman with a professional demeanor, approached Hayes to inquire about the situation. "Commander, we're hearing reports about a Vietnam War hero being recognized here today. Could you provide some background?" Hayes glanced at Morrison, who nodded reluctantly. "We have Master Chief James Morrison with us today," Hayes explained. "He's a decorated Navy SEAL who conducted numerous classified missions during the Vietnam War, many of them launched from this very ship." The reporter's eyes lit up with professional interest. "Would it be possible to interview Master Chief Morrison about his experiences?" Morrison looked uncomfortable with the suggestion, but before he could respond, Captain Rodriguez stepped forward. Master Chief Morrison just shared the story of how my grandfather died serving under his command during a prisoner rescue mission. I think the public deserves to hear about heroes like both of them. As the crowd continued to grow and news crews set up their equipment, a commotion near the ship's gangway drew everyone's attention. A small group of official-looking individuals was making their way aboard, led by a distinguished man in his 70s wearing a civilian suit but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. Sarah Chen broke away from her phone call and ran toward the group. "Grandpa," she called out, embracing the older man warmly. Admiral David Chen, retired, looked around the crowded deck with curiosity before his eyes found Morrison standing near the ship's rail. For a moment, the two old warriors simply stared at each other across the decades that had passed since they had last served together. Then Admiral Chen walked directly through the crowd, which parted respectfully before him, until he stood face to face with Morrison. "Master Chief," he said formally, extending his hand. "Admiral," Morrison replied, accepting the handshake. For several seconds, they simply looked at each other, two men who had shared experiences that few others could understand. Then Admiral Chen broke into a wide smile. "Jim Morrison, you magnificent bastard," he said warmly, abandoning military formality. "I heard you were telling stories about the Tay Ninh operation." Morrison chuckled. "Your granddaughter seemed to think you might want to hear some old war stories." "Sarah's right," Admiral Chen replied. "I've been wondering for years what happened to the SEAL who trusted me to drop 5-inch shells 50 meters from his position. That was either the craziest thing I ever did or the most professional." "Little of both, I think," Morrison admitted. "But it worked." Admiral Chen turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand something about the man standing next to me. Master Chief Morrison didn't just risk his own life during that operation, he risked the lives of his entire team based on his confidence in a 22-year-old naval officer he had never worked with before." The Admiral's voice grew more serious. "That level of trust, under those conditions, represents everything that's best about military service. Different services, different specialties, but absolute confidence in each other's professionalism and dedication." Hayes stepped forward. "Admiral Chen, we were hoping you might share your perspective on the naval gunfire support during the Tay Ninh extraction." Admiral Chen glanced at Morrison, who nodded encouragement. "It was the most terrifying and proud moment of my early career," Chen began. "Master Chief Morrison radioed for immediate fire support, but when he gave me the coordinates, I realized he was asking me to fire danger close to his own position." The Admiral paused, clearly remembering the weight of that moment. Standard procedure would have been to refuse such a request. The risk of friendly fire casualties was enormous. But Morrison's voice on the radio was absolutely calm and confident. He said, "Lieutenant, I need you to put steel on target in 30 seconds, and I need it placed exactly where I'm telling you to put it." Admiral Chen looked around at the assembled crowd. "I was a young officer, fresh out of the Naval Academy, and I had to make a decision that could kill the very people I was trying to help. But something in Morrison's voice told me he knew exactly what he was doing." The Admiral's voice took on the precision of someone recalling a moment that had shaped his entire career. "I ordered the gun crews to load high-explosive shells and calculated the firing solution personally. The margin for error was less than 25 meters in any direction." Morrison nodded. "I could hear the shells coming in," he added. "That distinctive whistle that 5-inch rounds make when they're headed your way. For about 3 seconds, you're not sure if the calculations were right." "What happened when they hit?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fascination. Admiral Chen smiled grimly. "Perfect placement. The explosions suppressed enemy fire long enough for Morrison's team to complete the evacuation. But I didn't sleep properly for weeks afterward, thinking about how close we came to disaster." Morrison turned to face the crowd more directly. "What Admiral Chen isn't telling you is that he fired 3 more fire missions during our withdrawal, each one perfectly placed despite changing conditions and our movement down the river. Without his support, none of us would have made it home. The two men looked at each other with the kind of mutual respect that only comes from shared danger and successful outcomes under the most difficult circumstances. As Morrison and Admiral Chen continued their reunion, a new arrival made her way through the crowd. Dr. Patricia Williams, the museum director, approached with several other individuals who clearly held positions of authority within the naval heritage community. Master Chief Morrison, Dr. Williams said as she reached the group, "I'm Dr. Patricia Williams, director of this museum. I understand we have you to thank for one of the most remarkable Veterans Day events in our history." Morrison looked slightly embarrassed. "Ma'am, I really just came to see the ship. All this," he gestured toward the crowd and news crews, "wasn't planned." "Sometimes the best things aren't planned," Dr. Williams replied warmly. "Master Chief, I'd like you to meet Rear Admiral Jackson, current commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, and Captain Martinez, who leads our Navy SEAL Heritage Foundation." Rear Admiral Jackson, a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command responsibility, stepped forward and saluted Morrison crisply. "Master Chief Morrison, it's an honor to meet you, sir. Your operational innovations are still taught at our training facilities." Morrison returned the salute with equal precision, despite his age and the walking stick he carried. "Admiral Jackson. I'm glad to hear the training is still keeping our people alive." Captain Martinez extended his hand. "Sir, we've been hoping to interview veterans of your era for our oral history project. Would you be willing to participate?" "I suppose that would be appropriate," Morrison replied. "Though I should mention that some operations are probably still classified." Dr. Williams stepped forward. "Master Chief, with your permission, we'd like to propose something significant. The museum board has been discussing the creation of a special exhibit dedicated to Special Operations Forces during the Vietnam War. Would you consider serving as a consultant for that project?" Morrison looked around at the expectant faces surrounding him. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for something like that. There were a lot of good men who served." "Sir," Admiral Jackson interrupted gently, "you are absolutely the right person. Your service record speaks for itself, but more importantly, you understand that the real story isn't about individual heroics. It's about teamwork, trust, and the bonds between different military services working toward common goals." Admiral Chen nodded agreement. "Jim, these young sailors need to hear from people who actually lived through those operations. Not just the technical aspects, but the human elements that made the difference between success and failure." As the discussion about the museum exhibit continued, another interruption occurred. A man in his 70s, walking with obvious difficulty but moving with determination, approached the group accompanied by what appeared to be his adult children. "Excuse me," he called out as he drew near. "Are you Master Chief Morrison?" Morrison turned toward the voice. "Yes, sir." The older man's face broke into a wide smile mixed with tears. "Sir, I'm Colonel Robert Hayes, Air Force, retired. I was one of the 37 prisoners you rescued from Tay Ninh." The effect of this announcement on the assembled crowd was immediate and profound. Even the news crews stopped their preparations to focus on this unexpected reunion between rescuer and rescued. Morrison studied the man's face carefully. "Colonel Hayes," he said slowly, recognition dawning. "You were the senior-ranking prisoner in the compound. You helped organize the other POWs during the evacuation." "Yes, sir," Colonel Hayes replied, emotion thick in his voice. "You probably don't remember, there were so many of us, and it was dark, and everyone was focused on getting out of there." "I remember," Morrison interrupted quietly. "You were the one who kept the group calm when the shooting started. You made sure the wounded prisoners were evacuated first, even though you outranked everyone and could have demanded priority treatment." Colonel Hayes nodded, wiping his eyes. "Sir, I've been waiting 48 years to say thank you. Not just for getting us out, but for the way you did it. Professional, calm, organized. You treated us like military personnel, not victims." Morrison's discomfort with the praise was obvious, but he accepted the colonel's gratitude with grace. You were military personnel. My job was to get you home so you could continue serving your country. Colonel Hayes gestured toward his adult children. Sir, I'd like you to meet my son and daughter. They exist because of what you did that night. The son, a man in his 40s, stepped forward. Master Chief Morrison, I'm David Hayes. I'm a teacher now, but I served 8 years in the Army. My father told me stories about the rescue operation, but he never knew the names of the SEALs who saved him. Morrison shook the younger man's hand firmly. Your father saved himself and a lot of other good men by keeping everyone organized during the evacuation. Leadership under those conditions is harder than fighting. The daughter, a woman in her 30s, approached more hesitantly. Sir, I'm Sarah Hayes Mitchell now. I have 3 children who will grow up knowing that their grandfather came home from Vietnam because of your courage. Morrison nodded acknowledging her words, but then turned back to Colonel Hayes. Sir, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me for nearly 50 years. Colonel Hayes straightened slightly, falling unconsciously into military posture despite his civilian clothes and obvious physical limitations. During the evacuation, Morrison continued, you asked me to make sure we got Airman Thompson out first. You said he was the youngest and had a baby he'd never seen. Do you know what happened to him? Colonel Hayes smiled broadly. Master Chief, Jerry Thompson lives about 20 miles from here. He retired as a Chief Master Sergeant after 30 years in the Air Force. His baby is now a Navy pilot stationed at NAS North Island. Morrison's face showed visible relief. I've wondered about him, about all of you, really. You tend to remember the young ones. Sir, Colonel Hayes said, Jerry's here today. Morrison looked confused. Here. When word got out on social media that you were at the museum, several of us started making phone calls. Jerry was already in the Bay Area visiting his daughter. He should be arriving any minute. As if summoned by their conversation, another commotion near the gangway announced the arrival of additional visitors. A group of older men, most walking with the careful gait of those carrying old injuries, made their way onto the ship's deck. Leading the group was a man in his early 70s wearing an Air Force veteran cap and moving with surprising energy despite his age. When he spotted Morrison, his pace quickened noticeably. Master Chief Morrison, he called out as he approached. Morrison turned toward the voice, studied the approaching figure for a moment, then broke into the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all day. Chief Thompson, he replied warmly. You look good for an old airman. Chief Master Sergeant Jerry Thompson, retired, embraced Morrison with unashamed emotion. Sir, when Carol told me you were here, I couldn't believe it. After all these years of wondering what happened to the SEALs who got us out of that hell. Morrison accepted the embrace, patting Thompson's back gently. I see you made it to Chief Master Sergeant. That's outstanding. 30 years, sir, just like I told you I would during the boat ride out of there, Thompson replied with obvious pride. And my son, the baby I was telling you about, he's a lieutenant commander now, flying F-18s off the Nimitz. Morrison's eyes showed genuine warmth. I remember you talking about him during the extraction. You were worried about missing his first steps. I made it home in time, Thompson said simply. Because of you and your team. As Thompson and Morrison continued their reunion, the other men who had arrived with him began introducing themselves. Each had been a prisoner rescued during the Tay Ninh operation, and each had carried memories of that night for nearly 5 decades. Captain William Rodriguez, retired, no relation to the tour guide, had been a Marine helicopter pilot shot down during a reconnaissance mission. Master Chief, you probably don't remember me, I had a broken arm and couldn't move very fast. You kept asking about your crew chief, Morrison interrupted. Sergeant Martinez. You wouldn't let us evacuate you until we confirmed that your other crew members had been rescued by a different team. Captain Rodriguez nodded, amazement in his voice. I can't believe you remember that detail. I remember all of you, Morrison said simply. When you're responsible for getting people home, you remember everything about them. Major Dennis Sullivan, retired, had been an Army intelligence officer captured during a patrol near the Cambodian border. "Sir, during the extraction, you told me that intelligence officers were valuable prisoners and that I needed to focus on staying alive so I could return to my mission." Morrison nodded. "Did you?" 25 years in military intelligence, sir. I retired as a colonel in 2001. Your words got me through some dark moments during captivity. One by one, the rescued prisoners shared their stories of the intervening decades. College educations completed on the GI Bill, military careers that spanned decades, families raised, grandchildren born, entire lives made possible by a single night in 1973 when a team of Navy SEALs had risked everything to bring them home. As these reunions continued, the museum deck had transformed into something unprecedented. News crews from multiple local stations were documenting the event, while museum visitors found themselves witnessing living history unfold before their eyes. Dr. Williams approached Morrison during a brief lull in the conversations. "Master Chief, I have to ask, when you came here today, did you have any idea this would happen?" Morrison shook his head. "Ma'am, I figured I'd take a quiet tour, maybe learn something new about the ship, and go home. I never expected." He gestured toward the crowd of former prisoners, active duty personnel, and amazed civilians surrounding them. "Do you regret coming?" she asked. Morrison considered the question carefully. "No, ma'am. I spent 48 years wondering what happened to these men. Finding out they lived good lives, raised families, continued serving their country, that's worth a little embarrassment about the attention." As the afternoon progressed and the crowds began to thin slightly, Captain Martinez from the Navy SEAL Heritage Foundation approached Morrison with a proposal that would reshape how the Master Chief's story would be preserved and shared. "Sir," Martinez began, "I've been in contact with several documentary filmmakers who specialize in military history. They're extremely interested in creating a comprehensive film about the Tay Ninh operation and other missions from your era." Morrison looked skeptical. "I'm not interested in being the star of some Hollywood production, Captain." "No, sir, nothing like that," Martinez assured him quickly. "This would be a serious historical documentary, focused on the tactical innovations you developed and how they influenced modern special operations. The human interest elements would be secondary to the educational content." Admiral Chen, who had been listening to the conversation, stepped forward. "Jim, I think you should consider it. The tactical coordination between naval surface forces and SEAL teams during Vietnam was revolutionary. Those lessons need to be preserved for future military leaders." Lieutenant Commander Hayes nodded agreement. "Master Chief, we're facing new challenges in special operations, but many of the fundamental principles you pioneered are still relevant. A documentary could serve as both historical record and training material." Morrison looked around at the group of former prisoners who were still gathered nearby. "What do you men think? This is your story as much as mine." Colonel Hayes spoke for the group. "Sir, we've discussed this among ourselves over the years. Our stories should be told, not for glory, but so people understand the cost of freedom and the value of military service." Chief Thompson nodded emphatically. "Master Chief, my grandchildren need to understand why their grandfather came home from war. They need to know about the men who risked everything to save people they'd never met." Captain Rodriguez added, "Sir, there are probably thousands of family members of POWs who never learned the details of rescue operations. They deserve to know how professional and dedicated the people were who brought their loved ones home." Morrison was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the decision carefully. Finally, he nodded slowly. "If we do this, it needs to be done right. Professional, accurate, focused on the team rather than any individual." Captain Martinez smiled. "Sir, I can guarantee that the filmmakers we're considering specialize in exactly that kind of approach. They're more interested in operational techniques than dramatic storytelling." As plans for the documentary began taking shape, another significant moment occurred when a group of young sailors from a nearby naval base arrived at the museum. They had heard through social media and military networks that a legendary Vietnam-era SEAL was sharing stories aboard the USS Valiant. Leading the group was a young woman in her 20s wearing the rank insignia of a petty officer first class. She approached Morrison with obvious nervousness but clear determination. "Master Chief Morrison," she began formally, "I'm Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez, currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group. On behalf of all the junior enlisted personnel here, we wanted to thank you for taking the time to share your experiences with us." Morrison studied the young woman with obvious interest. "Rodriguez? Any relation to Captain Rodriguez here?" He gestured toward the Marine pilot who had been rescued during the Tay Ninh operation. "Yes, sir," she replied with evident pride. "Captain Rodriguez is my father." The significance of this connection was not lost on anyone present. Here was a second-generation military family, with the daughter following a career in special operations, connected to the very mission that had saved her father's life decades earlier. "Your father was a good Marine," Morrison told her. "Professional under pressure, concerned about his people, dedicated to the mission. Those are excellent qualities to inherit." Petty Officer Rodriguez smiled. "Sir, he told me stories about the rescue operation when I was growing up. They influenced my decision to pursue special operations as a career." Morrison nodded approvingly. "What's your specialty?" "Maritime special operations, sir. Small boat operations, coastal reconnaissance, personnel recovery." Morrison's eyebrows rose with interest. "That was my specialty too. Are you familiar with the tactical innovations we developed during Vietnam for riverine operations?" "Yes, sir," she replied enthusiastically. "Your insertion and extraction techniques are still part of our basic training curriculum." Morrison looked around at the group of young sailors surrounding him. "How many of you are in special operations fields?" Several hands went up, representing different specialties within the Navy's elite units. Morrison's expression showed genuine interest as he began engaging them in technical discussions about modern equipment, tactics, and challenges. "The technology has changed dramatically," he noted, "but the fundamental principles remain the same. Know your mission, trust your team, adapt to changing conditions, and never leave anyone behind." A young male sailor raised his hand. "Master Chief, what advice would you give to someone just starting in special operations?" Morrison considered the question carefully. "Remember that special operations isn't about being tougher or braver than other military personnel. It's about being more prepared, more professional, and more dedicated to the mission than the enemy expects." He paused, looking at each of the young faces around him. "Every operation you conduct should make the next one safer and more effective. Learn from every mission, whether it succeeds or fails. Share that knowledge with your teammates and your successors." Another sailor asked, "How do you handle the stress of operations where lives depend on your decisions?" Morrison's expression grew more serious. "By training harder than you think you need to, by trusting your teammates completely, and by accepting that some things are more important than your own safety or comfort." As the afternoon continued and Morrison shared more stories with the assembled crowd, Admiral Chen noticed something that had escaped everyone else's attention. The walking stick that Morrison had been carrying all day was not the simple wooden cane it appeared to be. "Jim," Admiral Chen said quietly, drawing Morrison aside. "That's not a regular walking stick you're carrying." Morrison looked down at the stick in his hand, then back at his old shipmate. "You always were observant, David." "Is that what I think it is?" Morrison nodded slowly. "Piece of the mast from the Valiant. Ship's carpenter made it for me when I retired. Seemed appropriate to bring it today." Admiral Chen examined the walking stick more closely. The wood was indeed naval teak, and upon closer inspection, small brass fittings were visible that suggested the piece had indeed come from the ship's rigging. "Jim, that's a piece of the ship that supported all of our operations. The museum would love to know about that." Morrison hesitated. "It's just an old piece of wood, David." "No, it's not, and you know it," Admiral Chen replied. It's a tangible connection between you and every mission you launched from this ship. It's history. Dr. Williams, who had overheard part of their conversation, approached with obvious interest. Master Chief, could you tell us about your walking stick? Morrison sighed, realizing there was no longer any point in keeping the detail private. When I retired from the Navy in 1975, the ship's carpenter presented me with this piece of the Valiant's mast. He said it was his way of making sure I always remembered the ship that brought me home safely from every mission. The crowd that gathered around him showed obvious fascination as Morrison continued. I've carried it for special occasions over the years, military funerals, Navy reunions, times when I wanted to feel connected to the men I served with. Dr. Williams looked thoughtful. Master Chief, would you consider allowing us to display that walking stick as part of our special operations exhibit? Not permanently, you'd retain ownership, but as a way of showing the personal connections between individual sailors and their ships. Morrison considered the proposal. Only if it's displayed alongside items from other veterans. This isn't about me, it's about the relationships between sailors and their ships. As the day's events continued to unfold, the news crews that had been documenting the proceedings approached Morrison for a formal interview. The reporter, a professional woman in her 30s, had clearly done her research on his background. Master Chief Morrison, she began, you've shared some extraordinary stories today about your service during the Vietnam War. What would you want modern Americans to understand about that period and the men who served? Morrison thought carefully before responding. I'd want them to understand that military service isn't about politics or glory. It's about dedication to your teammates and to the people you're sworn to protect. You rescued 37 prisoners of war during a single operation, the reporter continued. That must give you a sense of pride in your service. Morrison shook his head slightly. The pride comes from the fact that those men went on to live productive lives, raise families, and continue serving their country. The operation was just one night. Their lives afterward, that's what mattered. What about the 2 men who were lost during that operation? How do you carry that responsibility? Morrison's expression grew solemn. You carry it by making sure their sacrifice meant something. By continuing to serve with the same dedication they showed. By remembering that freedom isn't free, it's paid for by people who volunteer to put others' safety ahead of their own. The reporter nodded respectfully. Is there anything you'd want to say to the families of veterans, particularly those who served in special operations? Morrison looked directly into the camera. Your family members volunteered for some of the most dangerous missions our military conducts. They did it not for recognition or reward, but because they believed in protecting others. Whether they came home or not, they served with honor. That legacy belongs to your family forever. As the day drew toward a close, Dr. Williams approached Morrison with one final proposal. Master Chief, we traditionally end Veterans Day events with a sunset ceremony honoring all military veterans. Would you be willing to participate? Morrison looked around at the people who had gathered throughout the day, former prisoners, their families, active duty personnel, museum visitors, and local veterans. It would be my honor. The ceremony was simple but moving. As the sun began to set over San Francisco Bay, the crowd gathered at the ship's rail while a Navy bugler played taps. The sound echoed across the water, carried by the evening breeze that ruffled the flags flying from the ship's mast. Morrison stood at attention during the ceremony, his bearing showing no trace of the physical limitations that had been apparent when he first arrived at the museum that morning. Beside him stood Admiral Chen, the former prisoners, and representatives of the new generation of special operations personnel. When the ceremony concluded, Morrison turned to address the assembled crowd one final time. Today has been unexpected, he began, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. I came here as a tourist and found myself surrounded by family, shipmates, fellow veterans, and the families of men I was privileged to serve with. He paused, looking out over the water. Military service connects people across generations and across time. The young sailors here today are part of the same tradition that motivated the men who built this ship, who served aboard her, and who continue to serve our nation around the world. Morrison gestured toward the former prisoners who were gathered nearby. These men represent why we serve, not for glory or recognition, but to bring our people home safely so they can live the lives they've earned through their service and sacrifice. As applause echoed across the ship's deck, Morrison stepped back from the rail, his participation in the day's events officially concluded. But the impact of his presence would continue long after he left the museum. In the weeks that followed Morrison's unexpected appearance at the USS Valiant, the story spread far beyond the Bay Area. Video footage of his reunions with former prisoners, his conversations with young sailors, and his formal interview were shared across social media platforms and military networks worldwide. The documentary project that Captain Martinez had proposed moved forward quickly, with filmmakers eager to capture not just Morrison's stories, but the broader impact of special operations during the Vietnam era. Several of the former prisoners agreed to participate, sharing their perspectives on the rescue operation and its aftermath. Dr. Williams reported that museum attendance increased significantly in the months following Veterans Day, with visitors specifically requesting information about the Special Operations exhibit that was being developed around Morrison's experiences and artifacts. Most significantly, several other Vietnam-era veterans came forward to share their own stories, inspired by Morrison's willingness to speak publicly about previously classified operations. The museum became a focal point for collecting and preserving oral histories from an era that was rapidly fading from living memory. Petty Officer Rodriguez and her colleagues incorporated lessons from Morrison's tactical innovations into their own training programs, ensuring that hard-won knowledge from Vietnam would inform the next generation of special operations personnel. 6 months later, Morrison returned to the USS Valiant for the opening of the Special Operations exhibit that had been created around his experiences. This time, he came not as an anonymous visitor, but as the guest of honor for a ceremony attended by active duty personnel, veterans, and military leadership from throughout the region. The exhibit featured artifacts from multiple eras of special operations, but its centerpiece was a detailed recreation of the operations center aboard the Valiant during the Vietnam era. Morrison's walking stick was displayed prominently, alongside similar personal items donated by other veterans. Interactive displays allowed visitors to learn about the tactical innovations developed during riverine operations, the coordination between different military services, and the personal stories of both those who conducted missions and those who were rescued during them. But perhaps most importantly, the exhibit emphasized the continuing relevance of the principles that had guided Morrison and his contemporaries: teamwork, dedication, professional excellence, and an unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home safely. As Morrison walked through the exhibit during its opening ceremony, surrounded by family members of the men he had served with and the new generation of sailors who were carrying forward their traditions, he reflected on the unexpected way his story had been preserved and shared. "I never thought anyone would be interested in old war stories," he told Dr. Williams as they concluded the tour. "These aren't just war stories," she replied. "They're lessons about leadership, sacrifice, and the bonds that connect people across generations. That's why they matter." As the sun set over San Francisco Bay once again, Morrison stood on the deck of the USS Valiant, looking out over water that reminded him of other oceans, other missions, other times when everything had depended on the skill and dedication of the people around him. The teenagers who had mocked him during his first visit were there again, this time as volunteers helping with the exhibit opening. They approached him with obvious respect, asking questions about his experiences and listening carefully to his answers. Sarah Chen, Admiral Chen's granddaughter, had become one of the museum's most enthusiastic volunteers, specializing in programs that connected young people with military veterans. She introduced Morrison to her school friends, who listened with genuine interest as he shared stories about teamwork, dedication, and service. The former prisoners and their families had become regular visitors to the museum, often serving as volunteer guides who could share first-hand accounts of the operations that had brought them home safely. Most significantly, the young sailors who had met Morrison during that first unexpected encounter continued to stay in touch, seeking his advice on their careers and sharing their own experiences as they developed into the next generation of special operations leaders. As Morrison prepared to leave the museum for the second time, he paused at the ship's rail one final time. The walking stick that had been his constant companion for decades was now part of the permanent exhibit, but he no longer needed it for support. The connections he had made, the stories he had shared, and the legacy he had helped preserve had given him strength he didn't know he still possessed. The impact of a single Veterans Day visit had rippled outward in ways that no one could have anticipated. A man who had served in silence for decades had found his voice, a new generation of sailors had connected with their heritage, and families had learned details about their loved one's service that had been hidden for nearly half a century. But perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrated that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they're elderly men with walking sticks who come to museums just to remember. Sometimes they're young sailors learning to carry forward traditions they're only beginning to understand. Sometimes they're the family members who support those who serve, sharing in sacrifices they never chose but bear with dignity and pride. The lesson of Master Chief Morrison's unexpected day at the USS Valiant was simple but profound. Every veteran has a story worth hearing, every family touched by military service carries a legacy worth preserving, and every generation has the responsibility to honor those who came before while preparing those who will follow. His story reminds us to look more carefully at the quiet heroes walking among us, to treat every veteran with the respect they have earned, and to remember that freedom isn't free, it's paid for by people who volunteer to serve something larger than themselves. This is Silent Legends, where forgotten heroes finally get the recognition they deserve. If this story of unexpected heroism and the bonds between generations of warriors moved you, subscribe for more tales of the quiet courage that shapes our world. And in the comments, share your thoughts. Have you ever encountered a veteran whose story surprised you? What military families in your life carry legacies they've never fully shared? How can we better honor the service and sacrifice of those who protected our freedom? Hit that like button to honor those who served in silence, and remember, sometimes the most important people in the room are the ones who never expected to be noticed.